Hello, 3% community. It is wonderful to be here with you today. I am recording this from Austin, Texas, hence my background. And my name is Jen Ostrich, and I am the co-founder of a company called Change Positive, where we've reinvented the feedback process in a method we call Shift Positive. And also the president of my own coaching business, where I'm an executive coach helping leaders to define their leadership brand. So I come to you today with a background of 15 years in advertising in the account management discipline. And about 10 years ago, I decided to make a change and go back to school and get certified in executive coaching. And it was in that process when I realized, I was learning all of this great stuff, having a lot of self-awareness and personal insights. And I realized I wish I knew a lot of this or was taught to be able to see things through this view when I was in advertising. And it reminded me also of when I was in college studying advertising. And then I got to New York City in my first role, which happened to be a new business. And I thought to myself, there was not any textbooks teaching you how to manage people, personalities, and egos. And I realized that was a lot of what I was doing and continued to do throughout the course of my career. So while this conference is here focused on the decade of change, I think some things remain the same in the sense that we still need to know how to motivate others and be successful in working with each other. And so that's really what I want to talk to you about today. Today is an invitation to look at leadership and how we interact with one another through a new lens. It's really an opportunity to see each other through new eyes. I'm going to introduce to you 3 questions as prompts and then walk you inside of each one of those to tell you a little bit about how that might help you change your view and to be more successful as a result. And then leave you with a couple good resources for how you or your organization can dig deeper into each of those areas. So we'll be taking a look at what if you knew what motivates your leaders? And then what if we looked at each other through the lens of what is right about an individual versus what is wrong? And finally, what if we learn to ask different questions? So that's what we're going to dive into today. Stay tuned. And I hope to also be able to chat with some of you in the speaker meet and greet. So first question, what if we knew what motivates our people? I was shocked to see in a recent Gallup survey, the global workforce study, that 85% of employees are disengaged. And it's no surprise given how much we've been faced with this past year and a half. But the reality is when we don't understand people at their core and primarily what motivates them, it's hard to keep others engaged. And so what I think is helpful before we talk about how to understand and how to learn what those motivations are is just understand a little bit about people first. So I like to show this graphic. I always say picture it as a 4-tiered wedding cake, because that's a little bit more scrumptious to picture in your mind. But as it shows here, if you look at kind of that bottom layer and you consider that foundational piece, our belief system. And if you think about it as our belief system drives our thoughts, which sits above that. And then above that are our behaviors. And so if our beliefs drive our thoughts drive our behaviors. And as a result, we get our actions, how we show up in the world, or the results of what it is we're trying to do. And oftentimes when we're trying to get a different result from someone, or we're looking for them to act a different way, we simply tell them that we just think we need them to change their behavior. And sometimes it is that simple. Sometimes someone just needs that awareness of that behavior and they're able to make that shift. But oftentimes it's much more difficult than that. And that's because that behavior is being driven by something down at that base level, that belief system. And our belief system is this, like, I think of it as almost like our internal code. If you think about the computer as an operating system and all the code behind it that tells it what to do and how to function. Well, that's essentially how our belief system works. It's internal to us, it's ingrained in us, and it's driving our thoughts and our behaviors and our actions. And that's what's driving how we show up in the world. And so when we're talking about creating developmental change or working with leaders to create behavioral shifts, it's really challenging when you have to rewire your belief system. And so where do our beliefs come from? Well, there are lots of influences. Of course, our upbringing, we take on a lot of things that our parents teach us and what their beliefs are. Then as we get out into the world, we get exposed to other people and we learn and potentially adopt to some of their belief systems. Of course, we have our own life experiences, and those help us develop some of our beliefs, along with cultural or religious influences, as well as the people that we spend the most time with. And then there's some of the stuff that's a little bit deeper, such as our own motivations that can drive our beliefs and even our fears. And what can be tricky about the fears is oftentimes we have a fear of something and we might tell ourselves, I can't do that, or I'm scared that this is going to happen. And those become stories that we tell ourselves. And when we tell ourselves those repeatedly, we actually start to believe them. And so then those become part of our belief system. So again, thinking about those beliefs driving our thoughts and our thoughts driving our behaviors, fear can play a major role in our belief system as well. So what can be helpful, and looking at this next image of an iceberg, is to think of ourselves almost with this iceberg analogy. There's the piece that sticks up above the water, and that's as people, those are the things that we can observe in one another. Our behaviors, even some of our personality traits or attitudes, it's visible to the naked eye. But then, like an iceberg, there's quite a bit of depth underneath the surface. And that's where, for us, it's at our subconscious level. We're not walking around thinking these things out loud, but that's where some of our defense mechanisms, our core motivators, and our fears and anxieties come into play. And again, just like in that layered cake I showed you, it's these things down at the bottom of the surface that drive what show up above the surface. And so it can be incredibly insightful to understand for yourself, but also for others as you're thinking about how to engage and motivate others, particularly on your team, to understand what's happening down at that level of depth. And so that leads me to the first couple of resources I want to share with you. The first one is, you may have heard of it because it's starting to catch a lot of buzz lately, especially since Brene Brown featured it on her podcast within the last year. And that is the Enneagram. And the Enneagram, by short and simple definition, is a personality assessment of sorts. But what makes it different than the others that are out there is it accesses, through the questions that you answer, your subconscious, and it gets to the bottom of that iceberg. And what it's looking for is it's looking to name for you what your core motivation is. And so in the Enneagram model, there are 9 different types, and you are typed based on your core motivator. So for example, a 1's core motivator is the need to get it right, or to have that be precise and exact, the need to get it right or do the right thing. Where a 2's motivator is to be liked. And so that shows up as being helpful in order to make sure that you're liked. And we can go around the wheel, and each type has its own core motivation. Now, these core motivations are usually driven by something that you ultimately fear, or the thing that you're telling yourself potentially that you're trying to avoid. Brene Brown taught us that also is somewhat like shame. What is the thing that we are worried that we're not enough of? And so in the 1's case, where it's that need to get it right, it's because if the 1 feels they make a mistake, then they feel they are a mistake. And so there is something deep and meaningful about each of the core motivations, because it directly connects back to what that person's sense of self-worth is, or what they deeply internally fear. And so that's what's really powerful about it. And the assessment in particular that I like, because not only have they made it really useful for the business, for inside an organization, so you can look at it at a team level or an individual level. It's called Integrative 9, integrative9.com, and you can see where you can take the assessment yourself. Now, it is very in-depth and sometimes can be difficult to unpack without a professional helping you to kind of understand all of it. So know that, and you can reach out and find resources and folks that are able to help you with that. But it can be incredibly insightful. I feel with my clients, it takes their self-awareness up by at least 50%. And it can be difficult in the sense that it really mirrors back the why behind how you think, feel, and act, because it's that why, it's that core motivator that's going to help you understand why you're showing up in those ways, kind of above the water in the iceberg analogy. So that's one wonderful resource. And then a simpler one that I love to suggest for managers to do with their teams. I love this as an onboarding exercise in the first 30 days when you've got someone new to your team. And that is these 5 questions. And these 5 questions are inspired by a book, Unlocking Generational Codes. And this was written, I think, about 10 years ago when there was the onset of, I think, 4 or 5 generations in the workplace at once and a lot of trigger points firing off. And the philosophy behind it is if we can understand someone's beliefs and motivations behind what drives them, and we can appreciate those differences from generation to generation, maybe that will help us find the synergies we need to be more effective together. So I love the idea of a manager answering these questions for him or herself, and then having the team also do it. Because what one of the most basic ahas might be is that your answers are quite different. And so just recognizing the need in a manager role that you have to find the way to motivate that person based on their motivations, not your motivations. And so the opportunity to see where there's differences and maybe similarities so you can be creating the most effective team. So that leads us to question number 2. What if we focused on what was right in individuals, what was right about people, what actually helped them to thrive, instead of our tendency, which is to point out what's wrong in a situation or a person and try to fixate on how to fix that? So this is really inspired by the field of study known as positive psychology. And if you're not familiar with it, by simple definition, positive psychology is the scientific study of what is right in an individual, organization, or community, what helps an individual to thrive, or that study of flourishing and well-being. And this field of study in the late 90s, inspired by Marty Seligman, opened up a whole new repertoire of skills and characteristics in people that just weren't studied before. When we started to look at what's right in an individual, it started to open up some qualities that help them to thrive. Things like grit and optimism and hope, and looking at post-traumatic growth instead of simply studying post-traumatic stress, emotional intelligence, strength in relationships, our strengths overall, and how to leverage each of these things. And it became just a different way to look at people. And it required you to shift, though, your mindset, because we're so used to looking for how people fall short or why there's a problem exists, instead of looking at what's actually working and what are the variables that we want more of. And so this is really the distinction between understanding that, alleviating the negative or understanding the negative is not the same as reproducing and encouraging the positive. And that's really the distinction here. And so I want to play a short video clip by Marcus Buckingham, and he speaks to kind of the distinction of this mindset, which I think is a really helpful way to understand what we mean by kind of positive psychology and looking for what's right.
Martin Seligman was the past president of the American Psychological Association. In 1999, he had an inauguration speech in which he said, basically, psychology is half-baked. We've baked the part about mental illness, about disease and damage, but the other side, the side of strengths, of what makes life worth living, is unbaked. And he famously quoted that they have 40,000 studies on depression and less than 400 on joy, making the point that everywhere you look, we seem to think that excellence is just the opposite of failure. So we study divorce to learn about marriage. We study unhappy customers to learn about the happy ones. We study disgruntled employees to learn how to engage employees. We study depression and neurosis and psychosis to learn about joy. Everywhere you look, we seem to think, in our society entirely, we learn to give people credit. We focus on their debt. Everywhere you look, we seem to think that good's the opposite of bad. And if you want good, you should study bad and invert it. We're wrong, he said. If you study bad and invert it, you get not bad. And his point was just it's different. Studying depression teaches you a lot about depression. Tells you nothing about joy. We learn from our mistakes. No, we learn about the characteristics of mistakes from mistakes. You learn nothing about success from studying failure.
Okay, thank you for taking a look at that. I hope that helps connect that dot for you. This idea of, studying studying failure is going to teach us nothing about success, right? And so, but this obsession with wanting to think about things about what's wrong and the way that society has done that, there is a reason for that. It is kind of the biology and the neurology of our brain. And it is something called negativity bias. And the simple fact is that we are more prone to hold on to negative emotions. We actually feel more positive emotions in a given day, but the negative ones have this stickiness factor. And those are the ones that stick out for us. When it comes to feedback, for example, you could receive all this positive feedback, but the one negative thing, the thing that really kind of got you, that you feel you fallen short on, that's going to be the thing that you remember the most. And all of the other stuff almost seems to fall by the wayside. Well, that is our brain and our negativity bias. And so to be able to adopt this concept of and this shift in mindset, and be open to the repertoire of characteristics within positive psychology, we have to, rework our brain and think about things differently. And so there's a concept literally called positivity offset. And it's how can we work to prime more positive emotions in ourselves and in each other? Because what the research shows is when we are under the influence of positive emotions, we have a broader repertoire of thought. We're better at decision making. Our memory is stronger. We're able to build more trust. We're more creative. We're more resilient. The list goes on. And so the simple fact is we want to produce more positive emotions on a day-to-day basis. And we want to encourage that in one another, because that's when we're going to be getting the best out of each other. And one simple way of doing that is being able to look at people through the lens of their strengths and being able to share that, helping people feel seen and heard through their strengths. Because the simple fact is when we're using our strengths is when we're at our best. If you think about it like strengths strengthen me. And there's that saying of being in flow. And flow is sort of that optimal, that optimal balance between skill and challenge, where something's just hard enough that you're engaged, but you have enough skill that you're not overwhelmed and you don't want to disengage. And so finding your flow is when you lose track of time and you're working on something and you could just go all day and you don't even realize it. That's likely when you're using your strengths. And that's when you're your most engaged and you're most energized. And so when we're thinking about what would it take to engage our employees more, understanding their strengths, making sure they're being given feedback about their strengths and given opportunity to leverage those strengths is a key aspect. And I also want to explain a little metaphor that I love, a sailboat metaphor, as it relates to strengths. So if you think about a sailboat and the boat part is called your hull. And if there is a crack or a hole in your hull, the extent that you need to focus on that really matters in terms of how urgent is it and how much of a priority, how relevant does it seem that you address it right away. For example, if it's a large hole and there's water gushing in, then you've got a problem and that's something you need to focus on. But if it were to be a crack that just needs to be weathered and managed over time, then that's something different. And so I want you to think about the crack or the hole in your hull as your weaknesses. How much do you need to focus on what are, quote, your weaknesses? Or if you do one of those strengths assessment, how much do you need to focus on the ones that show up at the bottom? Not that that means they're your weakness, but just the ones that you've scored lower in. Well, you focus on them to the extent that it's urgent in that moment or in your role in general, like the boat analogy. So if it's something that you just need to manage and be aware of over time, great. If it's something that's getting in the way constantly and is an immediate issue, then you need to focus on it. Generally, that's not the case, or maybe you're miscast in the wrong role. And so instead, where I really want you to be focused is your strengths, because think about your strengths as the sail of the sailboat. That even if your hull is whole and you have no cracks or no holes at all, you still aren't going anywhere without your sail. Your sail is your power. It's the thing that's going to set your course and move you from A to B. Those are your strengths. And so it's incredibly useful to understand your strengths and to be able to encourage others to understand their strengths and leverage yourselves as a team through your strengths. And this requires us looking for those strengths, seeing each other through new eyes, not looking for where someone's falling short, but thinking about the times when they do get it right. What are they doing at those times? And what are the strengths that they're using? So that leads me to my two favorite resources that are simple and affordable for strengths. There's a Gallup Clifton Strength Finder, where you can get your top 34 strengths ranked, and they'll give you a really nice development plan around how to build your top 5 even further. And then there's another assessment called VIA, which is more character strengths. So I like actually both, because the Clifton Strength Finders can be more of the hard skills or skills you might use inside an organization. And the VIA can be other skills like gratitude and kindness and humor and things that kind of round you out as a whole person. So they have 24 strengths, and similarly, they'll give you a ranking and some ideas on how to grow even further and find new ways for those top 5. So that leads us to our third and final question. What if we learn to ask different questions? And the reality is, the moment we ask a question, it actually influences the way that someone thinks. And so, just to give an example, if I asked you, why didn't you make your budget numbers last quarter? Or if I said, how could you make your budget numbers next quarter? That's going to be two different conversations. The question that leads with why is going to be a lot of why, what went wrong and what led to it not happening. The question about how could I do it next quarter is going to be more of a solution focused approach. And it's going to be more ideas and things that I can move towards. The past has happened, it already occurred. It can be helpful, sometimes insightful to understand the why, but more importantly, it's better to understand the where we're going, and how are we going to get there in the future. And this comes from a field of study called solution-focused inquiry. And if we think about, asking versus telling, and we thinking about using questions that lead with why versus how, we want to be up here in the ask and the how quadrant. Because the reality is, when we ask questions, first of all, when we ask questions versus give answers, and we lead with how or even what, that's going to inspire much more of a solution-focused conversation and help us understand where to move to. If you think about when you hop in a cab, or nowadays an Uber, but the cab used to say to you, where to, not where from. So it's about shifting that focus of where do we want to move toward? What's the desired outcome? Instead of always worrying about where were we and what went wrong, it's instead where is success and what do we need to move toward to get there? And so that leads me to what is referred to in the field of appreciative inquiry, which I want to show you a bit more about here on a slide or two in a moment. But that leads to what we call the magic question out of the field of appreciative inquiry. And we use this in coaching too. And the magic question goes something like this. Imagine if you close your eyes and you woke up tomorrow morning and everything was exactly as you desired it to be. What would that look like? And so it's this opportunity to step into the future, to step into a more idealized state and understand what success looks like and define it and visualize it and really understand all the parameters that go into it. Because at the end of the day, we move in the direction of the things that we study deeply as a system. And if you are an agency or a company that's always studying where we went wrong and the mistakes that were made versus taking the time to visualize what would more effective look like and what would it look like if we succeeded in the future, then that's going to drive your course. And this was an aha moment for me when I realized that I worked at 8 different agencies, and every single time we lost a new business pitch, we got in a room to talk about why we lost. And never once when we won the business did we ever get in a room and say, who was on the team? What did we do differently? How did we win it? We just got right to work and went to happy hour. So I encourage you, back to what Marcus said on the video, to start to study success. This is about becoming obsessed with success and really focusing on success so you can move in that direction. And so this next slide I want to show you is just taking a quick look at the distinction between more of a problem-solving approach versus more of an appreciative inquiry approach, or one that focuses more on strengths. And the appreciative inquiry approach, it's also known as the 4D cycle, it allows you to go into a discovery mode, to look around and do an audit on what is the best of right now? What are our strengths? What's working? What are we doing really well? And then enter that dream state and imagine, back to that magic question, imagine how much better it could be. What could it look like if it was even better? And then combining that discovery and dream state and going into the design phase and really prototyping and mapping out the plans and what does it look like and what needs to shift and change in order to achieve that combination of what you already have versus what you would like to take on as even more effective. And finally, then it's the delivery phase. It's the what will be as you implement those designs. And all of a sudden now you're looking at things through the lens of an abundance of strengths instead of looking at things, clients or organizations, as problems to be solved. And so I invite you to consider that new lens and that new way of thinking. And so a resource for solution-focused inquiry and appreciative inquiry is one simple resource is a book that I love called 1001 Solution-Focused Questions. And it actually is that. It talks about the approach and the concept of it in the upfront, but then literally there's 1,001 questions, and they're categorized for different uses. But there's plenty in there that could be valid for strategic planning, visioning exercises with clients, but even just reframing when you have an employee coming to you who's stuck and you're tempted to ask them why it went wrong. Just reframing and flipping to one of those solution focused questions could open up a whole new arena of the way you both think and tackle problems. And then in general, appreciative inquiry, just as a field of study, Google it. There's tons of free information out there. That actual field of study is quite generous, and they put everything out there for others to use and learn from. So lots of great things there to find on the internet, and just being aware of that field of study. So bringing us to a close here, some specific ways that you can shift your leadership lens. So understanding each other through the lens of our core motivations, and understanding what drives us and what's most meaningful to us as individuals. Then learning to build people up and see people and recognize people through their strengths, and making sure that they feel seen and understood and validated through their strengths, and that they have opportunity and application for those strengths. Looking for what works, simply leveraging that magic question, becoming obsessed with studying success, just flipping that switch and moving much more toward a focus on desired outcomes and what success would look like. And then imagining that desired future, allowing yourself to really picture it and get clear. And finally, remembering that we grow in the direction of the things that we study deeply. And so if you're studying and obsessed with success and more desired behaviors and desired outcomes and strengths overall, that will allow you to move in that direction. So finally, as I said at the beginning, the invitation is to really start to see one another through new eyes, and to really shift your lens when it comes to leadership, and allow yourself that opportunity to see through new eyes. Thank you so much. I hope to see you in the speaker session. Bye-bye.